Column and match function with VLOOKUP. Dealing with loads of data is common when it comes to Excel. It provides a lot of easy to use inbuilt formulas and shortcuts. When dealing with a large amount of data, as one usually does when it comes to Excel, can be very frustrating, especially when you find yourself copy-pasting formulas and manually having to change every single parameter of the syntax every single time. So here's something that will make our lives a whole lot easier and stress-free. The column function used in conjunction with the VLOOKUP function. But before we jump right in, let us take a quick detour and recap what the column function is and look at the syntax. What is the column function? The column function is used to return the respective column number for a particular cell that is passed as a parameter in the column function syntax. It is given as equal to column open parenthesis cell underscore reference close parenthesis, where cell reference is the cell for which we want to find the column number. But remember, the cell reference is not limited to being a single cell and can be used for arrays too. A little side note would be that the cell reference is an optional parameter. In case we do not assign a value to this parameter, Excel by default assumes that this parameter holds the value of the cell where the column function lies. Let us implement this using VLOOKUP. Column function in VLOOKUP. First and foremost, we need to understand exactly how we shall use the two functions together. Remember when I mentioned how we would not have to keep filling in all the parameters every time we pasted a formula across a worksheet, or how we would not have to remember the column number for each cell? Exactly. Here is where we use the two functions column and VLOOKUP together. Let us look at the first and most simple use case, using column function for referencing a cell. Since we are already familiar with using the VLOOKUP function, let us look at this example and figure out how we can incorporate the column function. We're all aware of what is going on here. We are looking up the name of the student based on the roll number of the student. Let us recall the syntax for the VLOOKUP function. The column number parameter is difficult to gauge, especially when there is a great number of columns in the data. We can tackle this problem using the column function. The formula for the VLOOKUP function has been revised to this. Observe how we did replace the column number parameter with the column function parameter. That's it. That's how you reference a cell in VLOOKUP using the column function. Next, we take a look at how to use the column function for dynamic referencing, using the column function for dynamic column referencing. When dealing with a large number of rows and columns in your Excel sheet, using the ad hoc version of the column function is not the best approach. The immediate response to that statement is, what's the alternative? We simply need to use the column function in a dynamic manner. This would help us add and delete columns or rows without hesitation, knowing that this will not affect the formulas we have used throughout the worksheet. The next thought that crosses your mind is, what makes the column function dynamic in nature? To understand this better, let us use a live example. Step 1. Create a table containing the data, roll number, name, and number of items. Step 2. Create a table that will contain the lookup and reference value, which is the roll number parameter. Step 3. In order to find the name of the student, we shall use the VLOOKUP function, given as Step 4. Place your cursor at the bottom right of the cell and drag it to the adjacent cells to copy-paste the formula. Observe how some of the values obtained are incorrect. Let us take a moment to understand exactly what went wrong here. Step 5. Look at the corresponding formula for roll number 2, which returns an NA error. Observe this closely. The column reference value has been auto-updated from C2 to C4. Step 6. To make sure this stays consistent, we need to use the absolute reference where required. Try this for a taste. Dragging and copy-pasting this formula across all the cells will give us the answer that we are looking for. There you go. That's one method to use the dynamic functionality of the column function with VLOOKUP. One method? Does this imply that there is another method? Yes, there is, and it requires us to use the columns function. The columns function could be called an extension of the column function. Before we jump into the implementation of the columns function, let's quickly recap the columns function. Equals to columns, open parenthesis, array, close parenthesis, where array is the table array or an array formula. Points to remember are 1. Unlike the column function, the input to the columns function is a range of cells instead of a single cell. 2. The columns function returns the number of columns in the array. Now that we're all caught up on the basics, let's jump right back to implementing the columns function for dynamic column referencing. Using the columns function for dynamic column referencing. Step 1. Update the VLOOKUP formula with the columns function using this formula. We obtain the right answer for all the roll numbers. Step 2. Insert a column age between number of items and name. Observe how the student names have not changed despite the fact that there is a whole new column in the table. Let's break down the revised syntax for VLOOKUP with columns to understand this a whole lot better. Let's break this down further and focus on the columns part of the formula. Columns, open parenthesis, $A, $2 is to D2, close parenthesis. Here we have provided an array. The starting reference cell for this array will always be cell A2. This is because of the absolute reference that we have provided. The second parameter of the array will be dynamic and vary based on the number of columns at any given instance. You can try to experiment with this on your own by adding multiple columns. That's it. That wraps up the basics of the column function and how we can use it with the VLOOKUP function to make it more dynamic and flexible in nature. Now that we've understood the uses and the benefits of the column function in VLOOKUP, we shall look at how the match function contributes to the versatility of VLOOKUP. But before we jump right in, let us clarify that both of these are individually powerful functions and can be used independently. One could even go as far as saying that the match function is a derivative of the VLOOKUP function. What is the match function? Let us look at the syntax of the match function, where the lookup value is the value we want to find and is the required parameter. Table array defines the cell range we want to look at and is a required parameter. Match type defines the type of match you want. This is an optional parameter. The possible values are 0, 1 or -1. If undefined, Excel assumes this to be 1. Remember that while match function is similar to VLOOKUP, it returns the column or row number rather than the corresponding value to the lookup value. Now that we're all caught up on the basics of the match function, let us understand how this improves VLOOKUP. One of the fundamental problems with Excel is when you add or delete a column, the output could be completely different than expected. especially when it comes to VLOOKUP. This is due to the column number parameter, which is part of the syntax. The match function helps to tackle this problem head-on. Here is what the problem would look like. We've added column B, father's name, which has led the VLOOKUP function to return the number of items corresponding to roll number 5, which lies in the leftmost column. What we are actually looking for is the student name, which is now column 4. How does match help resolve this? Do you remember when I said match returns the column or row number rather than the value corresponding to the lookup value? We are going to use this to our advantage. Since match returns a numerical value, it makes perfect sense to replace the column number parameter of the VLOOKUP function with the match function. Let us try a similar example, except this time we replace the column number parameter with the match function. Observe the match function, which is given as this. Let's break this down for clarity. The first parameter passed is F6. When we look at the spreadsheet, F6 contains the string value student name. This is our lookup value. The second parameter is this, which is the table array and contains the column header. The match type parameter is set to 0, and thus match looks for the exact value. We have seen how the match function within a VLOOKUP syntax is a good option for many cases where VLOOKUP alone does not meet your needs. This concludes dynamic column referencing in VLOOKUP using the match function.